Good evening. You're watching the main news on HKIBC. I'm Raymond Yeung. Here are tonight's top stories. 4 people, including barrister Margaret, are arrested for colluding with foreign forces. Beijing hits out after the World Health Organization criticizes the zero-COVID policy. And a Palestinian-American journalist has been shot dead while covering an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank. 4 members of a group that helped anti-government protesters have been arrested on suspicion of colluding with foreign forces. They include former Lingnan University professor Ho Bo-keung, who was reportedly leaving Hong Kong when he was detained at the airport. He was accused of colluding with foreign forces, a charge under the national security law, which carries a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. Also arrested were barrister Margaret and singer-turned-activist Denise Ho. Former Catholic Cardinal Joseph Sen was also detained. They were among 6 trustees of the 6112 Humanitarian Relief Fund, which helped anti-government protesters pay for their legal and medical fees. Another trustee is former lawmaker Sid Ho, who is in remand on other charges. It's been disclosed that 19 people have been arrested for spreading false information about COVID. The government pledged to continue monitoring fake news, while a consultancy team studies whether misinformation laws in some countries are applicable to Hong Kong. Joanna Ho reports.
Security Chief Chris Tang told lawmakers this morning that as of the end of April, police arrested 19 people for spreading misinformation related to COVID. They included people who claimed they were infected and those who incited others to spread the virus and damage anti-epidemic facilities. Roundtable lawmaker Michael Tian noted that online false information, such as the city would be locked down, caused widespread panic at a time when the COVID situation was severe.
可唔可以參考法國局長？佢哋針對選舉立假資訊法，我哋就針對抗疫立假資訊。
He urged the government to learn from France's election misinformation law to tackle fake news on COVID. But Acting Home Affairs Secretary Jack Chan said there is a difference.
Yes, France does have a piece of legislation, but that is specifically to deal with false information in relation to election. Is not false information in general, so that law is limited in a way. If we look at the experience around the world, we know there is not a single piece of legislation that could tackle all this information or dissemination of false information.
Chan said his bureau has already hired a professional consultancy team to investigate misinformation laws in 8 jurisdictions, including France, Singapore, the United States, and Britain. The team has completed 2 reports and hopes to make a concrete proposal by the middle of this year. Tang, meanwhile, agreed with a suggestion that artificial intelligence and big data should be employed to monitor and analyze misinformation online. Joanna Ho, HKIBC.
Authorities have traced all 190 people who dined in the Yeung restaurant, which became a COVID hotspot. The Center for Health Protection said the customers were found through the vaccine pass scheme, but 3 have already left the city. 3 more cases were added to the eatery cluster, taking the tally to 23 since last Saturday. New COVID infections in Hong Kong rose slightly today to 280, including 32 imported cases. 3 patients died from the virus in the past 24 hours. Meanwhile, 8 government clinics designated for COVID treatment will switch back to general outpatient services from Friday. China has hit out at those making what it calls irresponsible statements about its zero-COVID policy. The World Health Organization had questioned whether the strategy is sustainable, but Beijing said its goal is to keep the population safe in the most effective manner. Chloe Fong reports.
As COVID cases in Shanghai continued to decline, most supermarkets reopened. This came as Beijing stepped up its defense of its zero-COVID policy. China's general policy of dynamic case clearing is not to pursue zero infection, but to control the pandemic situation in the shortest time at the lowest social cost, said Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian. He said the goal is to protect the health of China's population, adding that relevant parties should look at Beijing's strategy objectively and stop making what he called irresponsible remarks. Zhao's statement was a rebuff to the World Health Organization, which had voiced doubts about China's approach.
When we talk about the zero COVID strategy, we don't think that it's sustainable considering the behavior of the virus now and what we anticipate in the future. We have discussed about this issue with Chinese experts.
The WHO post was quickly dropped from the Weibo social media platform. Beijing's policy received a boost when research spearheaded by Fudan University in Shanghai found that without the strategy, up to 1.6 million people could die in a COVID tsunami between May and July. The study, which also involved U.S. academics, found that the level of immunity in China after a vaccination campaign is insufficient to prevent a COVID wave and could also see 2.7 million people needing intensive care. Shanghai, meanwhile, said half of the city's 16 districts have reached dynamic zero. There were 7 new deaths, while infections dropped to about 1,500, accounting for 80% of the mainland's total yesterday. Chloe Fong, HKIBC.
Overseas, people in the Palestinian city of Jenin are mourning the death of an Al Jazeera journalist who was shot in the head while covering an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank. This was the moment Shireen Abu Akleh was hit at the refugee camp in Jenin. Other journalists dragged her away and rushed her to hospital, but medics were unable to save the 51-year-old Palestinian-American. Al Jazeera said it was a cold-blooded murder by Israeli forces, as Abu Akleh was wearing a vest identifying her as a journalist. Israel denied responsibility and blamed Palestinian gunmen. But another Palestinian reporter who was wounded said Israel forces had opened fire suddenly. Tensions are rising in Sri Lanka, with troops beefing up their presence in the capital, Colombo. Soldiers were ordered to shoot violent protesters as people vented their anger with the government over the country's worst economic crisis in living memory. Winner Wong reports.
Soldiers with guns and armored vehicles line the streets of Sri Lanka's capital, Colombo, today. Tensions are high after the Defense Ministry ordered troops to shoot on-site protesters who damage public property or harm others. Soldiers and police have also been given the power to detain without a warrant. This follows a second night of violent clashes. The level of damage was clear to see in daylight. Hundreds defied a nationwide curfew last night to take part in anti-government rallies. At least 8 deaths have been reported as the United Nations called for calm.
The High Commissioner urged the Sri Lankan government to engage in meaningful dialogue with all parts of society to find a pathway forward and address the socio-economic challenges people, especially vulnerable and marginalised groups, are facing.
Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned earlier this week, but the protesters also want his brother, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, to quit. They blame the powerful family for the catastrophe in the country, with people struggling to survive as prices soar amid shortages of fuel, power, and medicines. Winnie Wong, HKIBC.
In the Philippines, victims of martial law under former dictator President Ferdinand Marcos are speaking up. This comes as his son and namesake, popularly known as Bongbong, looks set to revive the Marcos political dynasty with a landslide win in Monday's presidential election.
This was one thing that we didn't expect. This was something that we thought would not even happen decades after. Because why should Marcos, all of a sudden, why should another Marcos become a president? They're so stubborn, they're not arrogant. They haven't paid a single cent. Why do you ask me to forgive when in fact they have not at all acknowledged what they owe the Filipino people?
Marcos Jr. said he should be judged by his actions and not his family's past. He secured 31 million votes, more than double the tally of his closest challenger, Lenny Robredo. Another candidate, boxing legend Manny Pacquiao, conceded defeat, saying he had wanted to unite the country and fight poverty, but acknowledged that the people have spoken. Inflation on the mainland has risen at its fastest pace in 5 months because of higher food prices, as people hoarded supplies on fears of COVID-induced lockdowns. There was a steep rise in vegetable prices in April, but this was partially offset by cheaper pork. The Consumer Price Index rose 2.1% last month from a year ago, compared with the 1.5% increase in March. The Producer Price Index gained 8%, the slowest pace in the year. This followed efforts to stabilize commodity prices and increase supplies. Cathay Pacific says it's preparing for a rebound in passenger and cargo demand as the world slowly emerges from the COVID pandemic.
We currently have sufficient pilots, and we have many pilots who have not been actively flying for a period of time. So they will start to come back into active service as our business recovers. We have concurrently started recruiting again after a period where we did not recruit throughout the third and fourth quarters of last year, and through the first quarter of this year, we've recruited some 180 pilots from the local Hong Kong market.
For the first few months of the year, we were supply constrained due to the crew quarantine measure. But with the adjustment from the 1st of May in terms of crew quarantine arrangement for cargo crew in particular, we will be able to increase back our capacity. So our revenue outlook for the rest of the year on the cargo front will continue to be positive.
Now let's take a look at the markets. The Hang Seng ended the day up by 190 points. To the top 10 active stocks, Tencent gained $9.20, Meituan up $9.60, while Alibaba was down 35 cents. Kuaishou was up $4.40, while BYD Company was up $18.20. To the forex trading against the Hong Kong dollar, the euro's at 8.28, pound sterling at 9.7, and the Australian dollar at 5.50. Over in Europe, the London FTSE is currently up by 60 points. On to the weather now. Expect more heavy rain and thunderstorms tomorrow and on Friday. Temperatures will range between 24 and 27 degrees. Conditions will only improve early next week. Now let's take a look at the weather around the world. That's our main news for Wednesday night. Join us for more news at 11. I'm Raymond. Good evening.